Okay, so the title is Long-Range Disease Risk Prediction, Algorithm Information Fusion in a Life and Death Environment. I've changed the talk slightly given sort of where Barry wanted to go with this as a discussion as opposed to talking more about my research. I'll talk a little bit more about the problems that we're trying to deal with. I am in the Department of Medicine and the Division of Sleep and Circadian Disorders at Brigham and Women's and the Department of Medicine and Division of Sleep Medicine at Harvard Medical School. As I said, I've lost my title slide. Partners request that I talk about conflicts. I've consulted for a few companies, notably a metabolomics company called Metabolon, where I still have information. I still have non-public patent rights. I have royalty rights from patents that I've licensed to them. But what we really want to focus on is this idea of building an algorithm-level approach to fuse data. We talk an awful lot about collecting really large amounts of data, but very, very little about how we actually combine that data when we get it. So our particular interest is centered around caloric intake and disease. In humans, an increased body mass index is associated with an increased risk of neoplasia, type 2 diabetes, cardio and cerebro-vascular disease. In laboratory rodents, you can see the opposite, that low-calorie diets increase longevity and delay morbidity. So people have looked at obesity trends in the US for a long time. If we focus on what's called obesity, we're talking about BMI greater than 30. This is data from the CDC. A lot of you have seen this, but there's usually people in the audience who haven't, from whom get gasps when I show it. And I'll point out that the height and weight data I'm going to show you are self-reported, which almost certainly means they are severely underestimated. People always report their height as being taller than they actually are, and their weight as being lighter than they actually are. Keep that in mind when you look at this. This is obesity data from the United States in 1985. And you'll see that there are a few states in the United States where 10 to 14% of the adult population is obese. 86, 87, 88, 89, 90. Well more than half the country.
Yeah.
91, now we have states where 15 to 19% of the adult population are obese.
New one is
92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97. Now we have states where a fifth of the adult population is obese. 98, 99, 2000. 2001, we now have a single state where a quarter of the adult US population is now clinically obese. 2002, 2003, 4, 5. We now have states where almost a third of the population is clinically obese. 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010. Okay, 2010 is the last time they collected this data in this format. They changed the format slightly, but you can see in 1990, okay, which is already after I started, about half the country, but not a single state more than a fifth obese. 20 years later, about a fifth of the country has a third of their adults obese. So now they changed the way of reporting slightly. You'll see you get basically the same map, but the colors are a little different, and you can't directly compare them. But that's 2011. It's this map right here. 2012, 2013, we now have states where over 35% is obese. 2014 and 2015, God knows what happened to that. 2016, 2017. And you can see we have states, 3, 6, 7, 8, that are 35% obese. Okay? And I'll point out again, those are self-reported. The data is actually worse than that. So now let's take a break from caloric restriction and get to what Barry wanted to talk about. So fake news, or other news that we can use. Or maybe, can we really use this news or not? What about getting more valid information? You just heard Frank talk about collecting multiple sources. We want to know, does that help? In reality, we really want to know, does that always help? Is it always useful to collect more information? And again, I'm putting in the caveat, valid information. I'm not even considering when you do anything wrong. I'm just considering if you get perfect information, does it always help you? Let's start with this piece of fake news. If you are born February 9th, you do not get cancer. For the sake of this talk, this is correct. We have learned something. In fact, we've learned something that's pretty fundamentally important. People born under the sign of Aquarius do not get cancer. we have again learned something. And in fact, we've extended our knowledge. We have taken a single date and we have increased it 30-fold. What happens if we figured out the second one first? Now we get this one and we say we haven't learned anything. Okay, this seems pretty straightforward and pretty obvious. Nobody in this room is going to be confused about this at all. Let's talk about a slightly different case. This is biomarker QQX1573A. Anybody who has done any of these things can tell this comes from a pretty complicated screen. Okay, this is not a simple one-plate screen. This is pretty complicated. And if you have a normalized value between 540 and 1470, you do not get cancer. All right, these are pretty exact numbers. Okay, we know that we have to normalize it. We know it's coming from a pretty complex screen. And I am telling you it is right for the sake of this talk. We've learned something. What if we also know this? We've learned something and we've extended our knowledge. So do we gain in information? What if I've just made it much worse? Because it's no longer they don't get cancer, it's now they rarely get cancer. Okay, rarely becomes a pretty vague term. Let's make it a little bit worse. In fact, let's make it a lot worse. They're less likely to get cancer. Is there still useful information in combining these? How do we combine these? How do you possibly scale these two things, where one is an absolute univariate or dichotomous or discrete variable, and the other one is a completely nebulous biomarker we don't have any idea what it means? How do we combine them? Can we combine them? But before we get there, what if this is true? Lo and behold, if you look at this biomarker in these people, they have a value of 900 plus or minus 30. Does anybody realize why they have that value? Because the value of this biomarker is 30 times the number of days since the beginning of the year of your birth date. They're redundant information. They're totally redundant information. The same exact statement as people who are Aquarians don't get cancer. The difference is in the first case, I put it in a format where you have knowledge that we typically don't have when we're actually trying to solve these problems. So does more valid information help? Only to the extent that you're actually gaining discrete knowledge or distinct knowledge. Let's talk about Huntington's disease. It's a neurodegenerative disease, typically from onset to death is over 20 years. It involves cognitive, psychological, and physical impairments. It is reportedly always bilateral, and mechanistically, well, that should be bilateral, not bilaterals, sorry about that. Mechanistically, the argument should be that the argument should always be bilateral. We did, now, for the sake of this, we have done an in-depth data analysis, and we find an unusual case. This is an individual who cognitively has mild to moderate disease. Psychologically, they have mild to moderate disease. And in their right arm, they have mild to moderate disease. But in their left arm, they have severe disease. So we have either just discovered something really, really fundamentally important about Huntington's disease, okay, that this person has an area of their brain that for some reason is resistant to generation, or we have a really bizarre artifact. So we go back, we check all the data. And in fact, the people who collected the data did this perfectly. Again, I'm not talking in this talk about when the data is not valid, okay? What do we do with this? Well, the first thing you want to know is maybe the person had a stroke. Walking tests reveal mild to moderate disease. It's not a stroke. So what do? You have to now go back and figure out why this person is different. So you literally go back from all our sophisticated algorithms and our machine learning and our deep learning and everything else, and we determine the patient doesn't have a left arm. And the coding is such that if they can't do a task, they fail it, regardless of whether they can't do it because they literally can't do it. Data is valid. Data is very deceptive. Okay, the problem when we're looking at data as data is we often, again, don't know this, just like the biomarker argument that I gave a minute ago. So does more valid information help? Only to the extent that you're actually gaining knowledge that the questions and the scoring systems themselves are robust in what you want. It's exactly the point you just raised. If you ask the wrong questions, or you even code the questions wrong, And lest you think this is something that would never happen, this one wasn't fake news. This is exactly my data analysis from a Huntington, or almost exactly my analysis from a Huntington's data set. Okay? Let's go back to caloric restriction and obesity. The CAL study in 2003 showed that basically obesity affects the risk of almost every form of cancer, and that current patterns of overweight and obesity in the United States could account for 14% of all deaths from cancer in men and 20% of those in women. Okay, guidelines for healthy weight. This was a few years before the CAL study. BMI of 26 versus 21. Already twofold increases in heart disease, threefold increases in hypertension, eightfold increases in diabetes. Weight change roughly corresponds to a weight change of about 30 pounds in adulthood. And to put that in perspective, my BMI this morning was 26.9. Okay, so when we're talking about people that are at 30, they are way above this, let alone the people that are at 35 and 40 and so on. Let's go back to the CAL study. This is the map in 2003. Remember the maps I flipped through? That's the map today. You want to think about what these numbers have to look like if this is directly proportional to cancer risk? We need to figure out what predicts cancer. So how do we do long-range disease risk prediction? Algorithmic information fusion. This is the title. Look at all the opportunities we have. Genetics, demographics, questionnaires, clinical data, metabolomics, proteomics, lipidomics. Frank listed a whole bunch of others that I decided not to have room for. Look at the complications. Okay, now let's start talking about validity in addition to all the other problems that I just talked about. Low effect size.